Hey folks, this is Chris Smith of WildEarth Guardians. I don't know if you can hear me, but I'm hoping you can. Any indication in the chat that you can hear would be wonderful. Okay. We're gonna give folks just another minute to join. I've gotten a couple messages that people are figuring out how to use Zoom. If you are joining on the phone, welcome. That's great. I would give you a minute or so to try to join via the internet because there's a slideshow associated with this, and it'll make things a little easier for you. All right, here we go. Thank you all for joining. Again, my name is Chris Smith. I work with WildEarth Guardians. I do some of our wildlife advocacy and policy work here in my home state of New Mexico and more broadly in the desert Southwest. I want to first acknowledge the painfully obvious fact that this is obviously a really challenging time for people. I hope everyone here participating is healthy and feeling safe and secure. And obviously this presentation doesn't mean to be a flippant kind of escape from the real world that we're all dealing with, but hopefully it's an opportunity to put our minds and energy somewhere else for a little while. So this is kind of a trial period for WildEarth Guardians as coronavirus is ramping up. We're trying to pivot to more digital engagement with our supporters and people across the US. There may be some technical difficulties here. Bear with us as we do this, and hopefully we're gonna smooth these out and offer a lot more of these types of exercises going forward. Please stay on mute as much as possible. Ask questions via the group chat. And Taylor Jones, our endangered species advocate in Denver, is going to help facilitate and monitor the chat. And I will stop in periodically to check and see if there are any questions. At the end of the presentation, we are going to do a Q&A session. And there are, I know, people more knowledgeable than me on this call. And at that point, I would welcome people to go off mute and answer some of those questions for the benefit of the group. Just a few other quick caveats before we get going. This presentation is not a referendum or a discussion about the merits of hunting and hunters. If you want that topic, there's lots of other places for that. This is not the place for it. We're going to focus on the Western United States in this presentation, but the overall issue and picture that I'm discussing certainly applies to most of the US with some nuance and exceptions. And then this is going to be hopefully an ongoing series of talking about wildlife policy reform and wildlife governance reform. So this specific presentation is about where we are right now. And I'm hoping that down the line, we're going to have a presentation on how we got to where we are now. And most importantly, where we're going to go and how we're going to get there. But this specific presentation isn't about that yet. And to that end, if you have topics or issues that you'd like to see us discuss, please recommend them to us. And likewise, if you see potential collaborations or collaborators you'd like us to bring in, please let us know. And then finally, my last little disclaimer is there is one somewhat graphic image in the slideshow. I will give you a heads up when it's coming. As a wildlife advocate, I see a lot of graphic images, and this one I don't find to be particularly bad, but I do want folks to have the opportunity to not see it. So I will try to, again, give a heads up when it gets going. But we're talking about state wildlife governance reform and reimagining specifically conservation funding for wildlife at the state level in the United States today. And to start with, I want to talk about who is making wildlife policy decisions in the Western US. And this is basically who is doing that. This group of people, with some exceptions. These are our game and wildlife commissioners in the Western states, minus Hawaii, and Nevada and Utah don't post pictures of their commissioners. But by and large, this is the group of people that is making day-to-day wildlife policy decisions in every state in the US West. And I think it's, first of all, important to notice what demographics are represented here. These are the women who serve on these commissions, again, with a few photos missing. These are the people of color who serve on these commissions. And these are the women of color who serve on these commissions across the West. So the point I'm making here is that, like many of our democratic institutions here in the United States, representative is maybe a misnomer for a lot of our wildlife decision making. The group of people that we're discussing does not really represent demographically the people who live in the Western US. So just for fun, I'm gonna bring back all the white males who are serving on these commissions, just so you can see how much more dominant a force males are and white people, and specifically white males, are in this decision-making process. And just to bring everyone back so we can look at all of our some great, some less great wildlife and game commissioners. And I want to talk about the interests and groups that this group of people associates with or represents formally. And these are some of those groups. This is not an exhaustive list. It's actually really exhausting to go and find out who is associated with what group and then find their logo and put it on a slide. So again, exhaustive, or rather exhausting, not exhaustive. And I want to be clear that some of these groups do good conservation work. This isn't a naughty and nice list. I've worked with a couple of these groups that I think are doing some good things. But what we see by and large is that this group of people is dominated by three types of interests. Agricultural interest, and I would say specifically livestock interests. Consumptive user groups, that is hunters and anglers. And gun advocacy groups, or even gun makers. And that is pretty true throughout the Western United States, and I suspect it's pretty true throughout the entire United States, with some exceptions. I think the coastal states, the Western coastal states, are actually farther away from this than a lot of other places, and there are obviously states that trend more towards this than others, but I think this is a pretty telling example of who is driving wildlife policy. And I want to talk about how these groups are driving wildlife policy, and of course what policies they're driving. But at this point, I wanted to pause very briefly to see if there are questions right now. So if you've got a question, type it in real quick and we'll get to it, and otherwise we'll move on. Okay, I'm gonna move on, not seeing any questions. So one of the things that WildEarth Guardians works a lot on and is very passionate about are native carnivores. This is a Mexican gray wolf that WildEarth Guardians staff managed to capture on a trail camera. As of yesterday, there are officially 163 Mexican gray wolves in the wilds of the United States. But this carnivore, much like many of our native carnivores, were nearly entirely extirpated from the United States. They're seen as an inconvenience and competition to the interests that drive wildlife policy, and they're still persecuted by many of the people and policies that we have in place. and obviously Mexican wolves are not the only example of this, but I think they're a pretty good example of this suite of policies that has driven native carnivores to the brink. I want to talk now about the pretty basic set of influences on native carnivores that most people know, I think. Livestock growers and hunters historically and broadly, and I know there are many exceptions to this, but painting with a broad stroke here, they perceive native carnivores as a threat. Livestock growers perceive native carnivores as a threat to their livestock, and hunters perceive native carnivores as competition for the ungulates that they're trying to kill. And livestock growers and hunters have a deep cultural and historical relationship that has kind of, in some ways, made them one entity in a lot of wildlife policy decision makings. And they have a very strong influence on state wildlife agencies. And we're going to talk about the hunter influence a little bit later. And I don't think it's a surprise to many folks on this webinar that hunters largely pay for state wildlife agency work. And livestock growers have an outsized cultural and historic influence on state wildlife agencies, typically through commissions where they are often granted seats on these commissions. Both ag representatives and sportsmen often have standing seats on wildlife commissions and often have multiple seats. I want to complicate things a little more in this next slide because I want to take us down a little tangent that I think is important to the developing history of what is impacting wildlife policy in the Western US, because I think most people know about this dynamic on this slide, but there's an emerging dynamic as well. And this is taking place in a lot of places across the West, but there's nuance to it, which I'll talk about. And that's the impact of oil and gas and extractive industries on wildlife policy. And again, in this case, native carnivores. So oil and gas producers, like livestock producers, use or abuse, depending on your perspective, public land for private profit. And what I've seen on the ground here in New Mexico is a lot more of the abuse than the use part. Hunters are developing a relationship with oil and gas, which I'll talk about in a few minutes. But native carnivores fit neatly into a schematic where they are scapegoated by the oil and gas industry for environmental degradation that the oil and gas industry is carrying out. So what does that mean? And what does that look like? This blurry, complicated picture is all the revenue and expenditures for the Colorado Parks and Wildlife Department. And you're not intended to be able to see much. It's really, really big, and it's really complicated. But I want to look at a specific part up here, the top left corner, which is the Piance mule deer research and how this research was funded. And in this schematic, again, you can see where the money for this research project came from. And it came from ExxonMobil, Shell Oil, Encana Oil and Gas, other oil and gas companies. And if you follow some of these green lines that I couldn't fit on this image, you'll see some sportsman groups as well, including the Mule Deer Foundation. And as a native New Mexican, we like to dumb things down a little bit. Sometimes I get to say that. We prefer simple pictures. Here's the New Mexico Oil and Gas Association hanging out with sportsmen for fish and wildlife. And wouldn't you know it, there's one of our beloved former game commissioners, Ralph Ramos, who I would argue is not good for wildlife and indeed participated in coyote killing contests fairly frequently. Again, we're gonna get back to Colorado, but just wanted to show the nice complexity of Colorado compared to our simple New Mexican diagrams. So why do groups like ExxonMobil and Shell Oil fund this kind of research. Why did Shell Oil give $165,000 to the Piance Mule Deer Research Project? Well, they get something. They get a policy out of it. And again, it's sportsman groups paying for this research as well. And in this case, the policy is the predator control study to kill lions and bears. And I personally think the word study is pretty out of line here. This was a policy that was enacted shortly after the study concluded to kill mountain lions and bears in the Piance Basin in Colorado. And the reason is oil and gas extraction is degrading and fragmenting habitat for ungulates like mule deer. And it's a lot more convenient to blame it on mountain lions and black bears than it is to blame it on these big, powerful extractive industries that are paying for the research. And this next slide is a graphic image, so if you don't want to see it, I'll try to skip over it quickly, but you're going to want to turn away. This is the on-the-ground implications of this policy, again, paid for by groups like the Mule Deer Foundation and Shell Oil. This is a hound hunter having just killed a mountain lion paid for by public dollars. So the point of this little tangent is to show that historically it's agricultural interests and hunting interests at the controls of wildlife policy, but there's a vast underlying network of powers controlling these policies. And oil and gas can be substituted for other industries in different places. But suffice it to say that there are connections made that aren't always on the surface that I think it's important to point out. So why is this happening? Why is mule deer research being funded by energy companies? And we're going to get into the point where most people probably know what I'm talking about. Hunters, anglers, and gun buyers fund state-level wildlife agencies. And they have for over 100 years. And they do that through two primary means: the PittmanRobertson Act, which most people on this call have probably heard about, wherein there's an excise tax on guns and ammunition that trickles down to state wildlife agencies to do things like administration, hunter education, but also wildlife restoration and conservation, wildlife management. And then also through the sale of hunting and fishing licenses and tags, which go directly to state agencies to fund this kind of work. So again, to revisit the schematic we talked about, here are the interests at play. Here's clearly how they influence policy, in this case, on native carnivores. I want to take a moment to recognize a slight shift that I see going on. I don't think it's a big enough shift as it needs to be, but we are seeing a slight shift. And this is a news feed that came across recently from the National Wild Turkey Federation, which I typically wouldn't list as a progressive hunting group, but I thought this was really nice. This said, the myth is removing a predator will increase wild turkey populations. And the truth is that removing a random predator from the landscape has no impact whatsoever on widespread turkey populations. And I suspect most of the people on this call know that indiscriminately killing carnivores does not help with ecosystem balance or ungulate populations or turkey populations or protecting livestock by and large. So we're seeing this shift, but the overall power dynamic remains in place, which is that the public is not in control of our wildlife policy. And there's other nuances. I don't have time to get into them, but for example, we could take this same schematic of native carnivores and oil and gas, and we could replace big timber in the Pacific Northwest for oil and gas. And we could sub in black bears, where black bears are scapegoated because hunters see declining ungulate populations due, I think, to clear cutting and aerial pesticide application in forests. Black bears are a convenient scapegoat for big timber, and it happens that black bears also browse new timber growth, so it's kind of a double whammy for big timber. So again, this schematic plays out in different ways in different places, but I think it's important to recognize that There's a bunch of big money factors dictating wildlife policy. And again, here's a more basic look at what that can be wherever you live. So why does this matter now more than maybe it ever has? There is a big decline in hunter numbers across the United States. And this isn't prophecy or projection, this is truth. And it's playing out nearly everywhere in the United States with a few exceptions. And it's causing a lot of consternation. How is state wildlife management going to be funded is the question that most headlines will read. But I think if you read through the headline, the real question is who is going to dictate state wildlife management and policy? Because as we've seen, funding dictates policy. So hunting, again, is slowly dying off. This is from the Washington Post about 6 months ago, and that has created a crisis for the nation's many endangered species, according to the Washington Post. California scrambles to increase hunting to help protect public lands. And I find all these headlines very strange to read because I don't think they make sense, knowing what I know. Decreased participation in hunting and angling hurts conservation of all Arkansas species. So there's nationwide awareness or outrage or even alarmism about this decline in hunting and what it's going to do to wildlife conservation. And it's typically called a crisis. And I would argue, matter of fact, I did argue here in the Missoulian a few days ago that the decline of hunting shouldn't be a crisis for wildlife conservation. So where people see a funding crisis, or any crisis really, we see opportunity. Crisis is another word for opportunity, which is, I think, a nice notion to keep in the back of our minds, especially right now. So I think you can see it through two lenses. And if it's an opportunity, it's an opportunity to fundamentally change the system of wildlife governance across the United States. How are state wildlife agencies responding to this opportunity? Maybe as we expect they would, by calling it a crisis and by trying to recruit, retain, and reactivate a new generation of hunters. So this, again, fairly recent article a couple months ago. As hunting numbers decline, wildlife managers seek to diversify the sport. So there's this really concerted, broad effort by state wildlife agencies to increase hunting numbers in their states. And this is just one example. This is from Colorado, but we see it play out all over the place. And there's even a 3R or an R3 symposium that you can go to. And again, the 3Rs are retain, recruit, and reactivate. So this is where state agencies and sportsman groups, by and large, and companies like Broken Arrow and probably other gun companies are putting their efforts in terms of confronting this so-called crisis. They're trying to recruit and retain and reactivate hunters. And state wildlife agencies are playing their part. I think every state wildlife agency has a 3R coordinator at this point. Here in California, the state is trying to reverse the trend by recruiting, retaining, and reactivating hunters. Here's the PittmanRobertson Modernization Act, which would allow more of those Pittman-Robertson funds to go towards recruiting, retaining, and reactivating hunters. Here's the Target Practice and Marksmanship Training Support Act, which would divert those Pittman-Robertson funds to build shooting ranges. This is just a totally arbitrary snapshot from my email box, all the messages I've gotten from Arizona Department of Game and Fish recently. About 15 emails in this 1 month period talking about hunting seasons, buying guns, buying tags, and 2 emails about wildlife that you're not supposed to go kill. So again, we see where their resources are going, where their communications are going. This is a fairly frequent thing in New Mexico, is new hunting ranges opening up and hunter education camps being put on by our Department of Game and Fish. I suspect most people have seen that in their states as well. This is one of my favorites. This trend has actually thankfully gone away, but for a while, there were a lot of efforts to make pink an acceptable and viable hunting color rather than orange, to try to desperately attract female hunters. Again, I'm grateful that this has gone away. And then the final gimmick I'll talk about is in New Mexico. This just launched. This is the New Mexico Trout Challenge, where you get a nice little patch and a certificate if you catch all 5 trout species in the state. The problem with this, along with it being, I think, a bad use of money, is that 3 of these 5 trout species are introduced non-native trout that are making it very, very difficult on the 2 species of native trout to continue to survive. And New Mexico Department of Game and Fish continues to pump millions of non-native trout into our waterways for the express purpose of propping up sportsman groups for increasing angling opportunities. So we're at this crossroads, and I found a blurry picture of a crossroads 15 minutes ago. Why are we at this now? There's climate crisis, there's mass extinction going on, there's urbanization, there's shifting values around how we recreate, where our food comes from, how we spend our time in the outdoors. There's habitat loss and fragmentation from urban development and suburban sprawl and extractive industries. There's a decline of hunting, and that's tied into a lot of demographic shifts. There's a loss of public lands and access to public lands, especially under this federal administration. And there's rising public employee expenses. It costs more and more typically to run a state agency as time goes on. And by and large, license fees and the excise tax aren't increasing. And in fact, with hunting numbers decreasing, we're seeing costs go up and revenue go down. And here's how I see our options at this crossroad. I think state wildlife agencies are showing their commitment to recruit and retain and reactivate themselves out of this hole that's getting deeper and wider, and their shovel keeps breaking. And they're wearing all the little pink hats that they can, and it doesn't seem to be working. Or we can give up the ghost and embrace and seek public funding for a public asset, because that's what our wildlife is. It's a public asset. It's something on which our economies, our livelihoods, our enjoyment, our sense of self, our cultural values all rely. So I would argue the public should be paying for the conservation of this public asset. And I was actually talking to this with a friend of mine who used to own a candy shop recently. And he thought that this was a lot like running a candy shop in a neighborhood in which the kids are growing up and moving away. Parents are growing increasingly leery of candy. There's health trends guiding people away from eating sugary foods. Kids are more into video games than they are into candy. That's where they want to spend their money. And I think that analogy is actually really appropriate, because more and more kids are spending time inside rather than hunting. And the candy shop's rent is going up. And rather than think, what's a new business model I might implement to increase the viability of this business, the candy shop owner is just making bigger and bigger signs to try to sell candy and yelling "candy for sale" louder and louder and louder as the kids move away. So I think if we stick to the left-hand side of this crossroads and continue to try to recruit and retain and reactivate our ways out of this, we're going to continue to see this set of elements in our wildlife policy. So science is demonstrably missing from North American wildlife management. This article came out a couple of years ago. You may recognize some of the authors on there. Policy decisions are not based on science, by and large, in the American West in terms of wildlife. We have cash-strapped agencies. We have ecosystem imbalance and collapse. We have Lyme disease spreading, among other diseases. We have the continued persecution of native carnivores. We're going to see continued extinction and a loss of biodiversity. We're going to continue to see political and special interest driven politics, or policies rather. And if we choose another path, we're going to see fostering of biodiversity. We're going to see respect and healthy native species. We're going to see sustainable recreation economies, ecosystem health, democracy, seems nice in these times, and financially viable state institutions. And this choice, I think, is pretty obvious, but it needs a ton of work to get where we need to go. But this isn't a nation effort. I think people have been thinking about this for well over 10 years and starting to do things around it for maybe less than 10 years. But even state agencies are starting to step up and recognize the choice they have. So here is an article recently. Indiana's first female state wildlife director says it's not just those who hunt and fish. And I don't think it's coincidence that this was the first female state wildlife director who said this. Again, going back to those prior slides about the lack of true democratic representation on these game commissions, I think diversity brings new ways of thinking, and we need to pursue and embrace that. Here's another article that I just plucked out of many. It's time to bring wildlife policy into the 21st century. State agencies are prioritizing hunters over public health and the environment. So what this looks like in the future, rather than the bleak kind of Shell Oil funded study that we saw earlier, is public funding for real science, not fake science, which is then filtered through public input, real public input, in which the entire public's values are weighed equally, and it's not just ag groups and sportsmen who get an outsized influence. And then out of that, we get good wildlife policy. And we're going to have a future webinar on how we get to that and what public funding looks like. But for now, this is where I'm going to leave it. How can you help? You can join WildEarth Guardians. That's pretty obvious. We're starting to do more and more of this work in more and more places. And in the slide here, or in the chat here, I'm going to share a few links. So I know everyone is struggling in these turbulent times, but you are always welcome to donate to our cause. We're going to be hit by the coronavirus pandemic like everyone else. But I'm also offering a link here in the chat to sign up for our state wildlife governance reform efforts. So those are two ways that you can join WildEarth Guardians in these efforts. You can find out what's going on in your state. Maybe you know groups or people who are already working on this issue where you live. If so, that's great. If you don't, feel free to reach out to me, because there's a very good chance that I know the groups or people who are working on this, and I'm happy to put you in touch. And then finally, you can raise your voice. You can show up to game commission meetings or wildlife commission meetings. They're open to the public. You can write letters to the editor. You can write op-eds, etc. And you can speak up for a long-term sustainable and viable way of wildlife governance in the state you live. And I know that that's a little bit vague, but part of that is on purpose so that we can keep you in tune for the next webinar in this series. And with that, I would love to have any questions. Or comments. So Jeremy Nichols asked, what about creating revenue streams tied to non-consumptive outdoor recreation? That's a really good question, Jeremy. That has been broached in a few different ways. And the Outdoor Industry Alliance, I believe they're called, OIA, is not thrilled about that as a prospect, but individual outdoor manufacturers, outdoor gear manufacturers and retailers may be more open to that. So that's certainly an avenue that people are pursuing. Sarah McMillan asked, how many bears and mountain lions did Colorado kill in that study? I would be happy to turn that question over to Sarah McMillan or Lindsay Laris if they would like to speak up.
I actually don't know. So that's one of the reasons I asked a lot, but I don't know how many.
One of the reasons that we don't know is that the data is not available publicly yet. And we are waiting to see that data from Colorado Parks and Wildlife Commission. And we're hoping to see that soon because the first part of the study has been complete. Actually, the entire study in Piceance Basin has been complete, but we do not have publicly available data at this point.
Thank you both. And I would add that WildEarth Guardians sued over that quote unquote study. And my understanding is mostly due to procedural delays. We haven't gotten any good decisions out of that case or those cases yet. But that is still pending is my understanding. Kevin Bixby weighed in that the New Mexico Game Commissioner in the photo was not Ralph Ramos, but Robert Espinosa. That was a quiz for you specifically, Kevin. Thank you for getting it right. Rebecca Sobel asks, are any native carnivores more at risk than others? And does this vary by state? I would say, yeah, there are some native carnivores more at risk than others. Just offhand, grizzly bears, Mexican wolves, gray wolves in the Pacific Northwest and in the Intermountain West are some that jump out, but perhaps others would like to chime in with their thoughts about most imperiled species by our broken system of wildlife governance. Anyone? Okay, we'll go with those then. Rebecca Sobel also asks, what successes has WildEarth Guardians had reforming game commissions and redirecting board funds to conservation? We have helped to introduce a bill in New Mexico that would reform who sits on our game commission here in the state. And we were also part of a coalition that tried to push for a study that would study possible new revenue sources for our state wildlife agency. And we worked closely on both efforts with Kevin Bixby from Southwest Environmental Center, and I'd be happy to turn it over to Kevin for a few minutes if you want to expound on that,
Kevin. Thanks, Chris. Well, the bill, the very modest, uncontroversial, we thought, bill in the last session would have appropriated $200,000 in New Mexico to our New Mexico Game and Fish Department to do a study to look at funding options. And it didn't pass. It didn't get through the one particular Senate committee, and that was the fate of a lot of appropriations bills. And big disadvantage we had was we did not get it on the governor's radar, and so it was not coming from the governor's office. So it was sort of an outside shot at getting that funding study funded. But apparently our Game and Fish Department has enough money to get the study done itself. So we have our coalition in New Mexico, of which Guardians and SWEC are part of, will be meeting next week to discuss next steps to get that funding study done. And I just want to reiterate that the funding issue is the lever of change, I think, that we have. At some point, these game departments, they're going to have to see the writing on the wall, and they're just not going to be able to, double down on the 3 R's and keep the money coming in. So I think that's where we need to look. That's it.
Thanks, Kevin. And Lindsay, do you want to add anything about Colorado efforts, or not at this point?
Not at this point on the efforts to reform the commission. I think it's something that the state is looking at, and there are discussions about various mechanisms that we might engage in, but we don't have anything right now. And I know that this session has been a bit curtailed with the coronavirus outbreak and efforts to address that.
So I believe
This is Sarah McMillan. Oh, I'm sorry, Taylor, were you about to say something?
Oh, I was just going to interject. I think we have someone on the iPhone who has a question. I see you raising your hand. Let me unmute you. You should be able to speak to us. And can you
It's Sam, guys. Sorry, it's Samantha Berger. I was trying to raise my hand. I was going to interject on Oregon, if you guys would like to hear that.
Great.
Please.
So in Oregon, another step we've taken is really to organize as a coalition. And I know that there's a few others of you on the call that are part of that coalition, but we've created an Oregon Wildlife Coalition. And with that, we actually made a wildlife caucus in the legislature to put pressure on the governor for good appointments to the Fish and Wildlife Commission out here. And we're also attending every meeting, trying to make recommendations. It's a bit of an uphill battle for us because there's mandates that require different hunting and fishing and extractive interests to be represented on these commissions. So that's what we're doing in Oregon, and we have a similar effort going on in Washington as well.
Thanks. And just to clarify, the voices you just heard, Lindsay Laris is our wildlife program director here at WildEarth Guardians, and Samantha Brugger is our coexistence campaigner. She's based in Oregon. I wanted to get a couple questions that are farther up the chat. Are you familiar with any states that have a more equitable representation on fish and game boards or commissions? I think that depends on what equitable means. I do think that the Western coastal states certainly have more diverse in terms of demographic commissions. And they also have a lot of scientific acumen on those commissions, more so than a lot of other Western states. I dare say that New Mexico and Colorado are slowly moving in that direction. We're not where we need to be yet, but those are a couple of examples of quote unquote more equitable commissions. Let me get to a couple more of these. What about creating separate state agencies that only manage non-game resources? I have not heard of that as an idea. I think it's interesting. I think there's probably some inherent complexities and challenges in terms of determining what is and what isn't a game resource and what should be a game resource, for example. Because obviously any wildlife that is a quote unquote game resource is also an ecosystem resource. And so if you start managing a set of species as something to extract or consume, and then a set of species as something to otherwise enjoy or bolster your ecosystem, I think that it could get pretty difficult. Sounds like there was a bill in New Hampshire to remove the requirements for all members of the commission to have a resident hunting, fishing, or trapper's license, but that bill has been tabled. That's from Jill Fritz from the Humane Society. So Jill, if you would keep us appraised, that would be great. Or if you'd like to talk about that for a few seconds.
Well, sure. I mean, just that it also would have authorized non-consumptive organizations to recommend commission members and broaden the qualifications they could have to non-consumptive activities like wildlife watching and photography. And they've tried this in the past and unfortunately didn't make the committee deadline this year, but I'm sure they'll try again next year.
Great, thanks, Jill. And here's a question for Leah Barnett, who's also a WildEarth Guardian staffer. What do you see as an effective way to engage the hunting community? That's a good question. Here in New Mexico, we're working fairly closely with sportsman groups like the New Mexico Wildlife Federation because they appear to quote unquote get it. They know that wildlife funding and wildlife governance needs to change. And so they're actively working within our coalition. I would assume that in other states that dynamic is different. And so reaching out to those groups may be more challenging. I'd be happy to hear from other people on the call who have had either successful or unsuccessful experiences doing that?
This is Lindsay. We are trying to do that in Colorado, and Humane Society and WildEarth Guardians have been, dealing with that question. And from talking to some of the commissioners, I think just showing up at a lot of these meetings and being present at the CPW, the Colorado Parks and Wildlife Commission meetings, not just when it's issues that we wildlife advocates care about in particular, but regularly, and getting to know folks who are there and who actually are showing up regularly. I think that's really important. Obviously, it's a little bit challenging right now. The commission meeting this month was canceled. Next month will be virtual, but hopefully in the future we'll have more opportunities to build on those relationships and interact in person with folks that we can build those alliances with.
Thanks, Lindsay. Walter, would you like to talk about the Vermont bill, Senate Bill 48?
Let's see. Hello, can you hear me?
Yes. We can hear you, Walter. Go ahead.
Oh, great. Well, we've been trying now for 3 years. We've perhaps had our greatest momentum in this legislative session, which, like perhaps most legislatures, has ground to a halt, and we're completely uncertain as to what the future path is. But specifically, we've got a bill in the Senate, it's S48, and it includes a wildlife governance section that, if passed, would create a working group that would examine our current Fish and Wildlife Board, which makes game policy. Members of the board are exclusively coming from the consumptive world. And the other piece includes looking at funding for the department, recognizing, as has been discussed tonight, the significant declines in license revenues. And then lastly, the working group would examine fundamental policy. We have archaic policy in our statutes, and we are pushing to have essentially 21st century wildlife governance principles, many of which are articulated by Dan Decker at Cornell in many of his published papers, and trying to see if our decision making can be grounded in those 21st century wildlife governance principles. No idea where we're headed. There are so many moving pieces right now, but I think right now we've had the greatest momentum after being at this for, again, the last 3 years in the legislature.
Great. Thanks for sharing.
You're welcome.
Anyone else want to chime in with either a question or a comment before we wrap this up? I don't think I missed any questions, but I could be wrong. Okay, well, unless I see a question momentarily, I really appreciate all of you joining us for this first webinar we're doing in our new digital age. Any feedback is welcome, both on the substance, but also on the format or any technological difficulties. Please feel free to reach out to me. My email is posted in the chat and it's on our website. And I look forward to hopefully seeing you all again soon. Stay safe and healthy. Take care.
Thank you, Chris.
Thank you.
Thanks, Chris.